Hey everybody, so a couple of things. Today I'm going to read the rest of chapter 2 where we left off last time, and I will also be doing chapter 3, the entire thing. Tuesday is supposed to be the next live read starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll see if that happens. We are going to be moving over the next couple of days. It might happen that I have to push back live read for Tuesday either to Wednesday or possibly just skip it and go right to Thursday and maybe sneak one in between Thursday and Sunday to try to keep pace. So I'm just going to jump right in and start, and then I will be putting this up on YouTube as soon as possible afterwards. So if you missed this live, you should be able to catch it on YouTube. So, and a quick recap of where we were at. Mostly the end of the last reading was catching up with the people that are in Southron heading through the Endless Sands to Yulinar, which is where Wrath Ibath or Einelmon is from, and learning that Wrath has violated some of the rules of his particular society, and therefore there's going to be some form of punishment that he's going to have to take on as because of his willingness to help lead outsiders into his home. So. And we're picking up with Edge and Raymir, who we have not heard from yet in this book, but if you recall from the first book, they had made it to the top of Mount Iceblade and had discovered the location of the Twisted Spire, which is a tower believed to be housing some form of weapon that Wolfbane and the Nerathians were planning to use. So, you can go there. Edge Elvok blinked his eyes as something soft and cool flitted across his face. He blinked again, unsure of what was happening and why he was so cold. Shouldn't his fire be lit? Had the window to his quarters been left open again? Another cool breeze swept over his face, and he suddenly snapped awake completely. It was dark, with just a faint light shining dimly in the corner of his eye. He was sitting upright, almost completely covered in soft but insistently falling snow. Ed shook the flakes free and straightened, spinning into the fire he had allowed to go out. He realized the faint light was coming from a rising dawn and not the embers of the small source of heat, which appeared to have been extinguished for several hours, if not days. Edge moved swiftly to the small hole he had dug into the rock-hard ice and debris beneath the thin pillow of newly fallen snow. Raymir still dozed there, unaware of Edge's negligence. The warrior straightened out of the shelter and stretched his exhausted muscles. His body was stiff and sore, the wound in his leg having had little opportunity to heal. He and Raymir had wandered for days from the peak of Mount Iceblade, the downward path being significantly more difficult than they had expected. Their journey towards the distant tower had seemed to be a matter of perhaps a week at first, but now they seemed no closer than when they had first begun. Edge narrowed his eyes in the early morning dawn's light and strained to see the outline of the colossal structure, though he knew it was still a long distance off. He shook his head in frustration. They had maybe enough food for another day of travel, and then they would be subsisting only on melted snow. They needed to reach the tower within days, or Roman's sacrifice, for he still thought of Jonathan Blade as Roman, would be for nothing. Edge touched the mirage necklace that lay against his chest. Raymir had taken it from Jonathan Blade when he died, a token of his dedication and friendship. Thinking back for what seemed the millionth time, Edge felt he might cry then, but he steeled himself. There was too much still to be done, and he would need to lead the way. Roman, or Jonathan, was dead now, and there was no use in lamenting it. He turned back to the hole he had carved out and gently shook Raymir's boot to wake her. She rose gingerly, unsure of herself, but smiled weakly when she saw him. Pulling herself free of their shelter, she wrapped her cloak tightly around her body. Onward, then, my love. There was little else they could do. Pointing themselves in the direction they last recalled seeing the tower from atop Mount Iceblade, they continued steadily on. The first hour was pleasant enough, quiet and cool, but not overwhelming. The remaining hours grew more and more oppressive. The wind picked up slightly and became a steady breeze that, had it been in intervals, would have been a mild annoyance. As a constant presence, however, it was truly maddening. The wail of it surrounded them so that Edge and Raymir had to shout to hear one another. So soon they simply gave up talking. After almost 6 hours of marching, Raymir took the position in the lead and passed what was left of their rations back to Edge for him to divide. They ate in silence and plodded ever onward. When night began to fall, they refused to stop, though both were exhausted, sore, and simultaneously numb to every step. Only when the darkness became thick did they finally halt. Raymir and Edge, too tired to build a fire, burrowed into the snow and huddled together. The wind had stopped and the air was quiet, but the chill of the night was biting and thick. They dug deeper until at last they began to feel some warmth between them, and only then did the two fall into a fitful slumber. Raymir awoke first, and in frustration noticed her hunger almost immediately. She knew they were out of provisions at an unknown, but likely several days' distance from the tower. She shifted slightly in the snow and listened for the wind, but heard nothing. Then her ears pricked up more, as she realized it was not just the wind she could not hear. She shook Edge gently, and he slowly was roused from his slumber, She said nothing, but put a gloved finger to her lips and waited. Edge almost appeared relaxed until he realized the absence of sound that there was simply nothing to listen to. In the previous days he had, like Raymer, heard the wind whistling through the mountains or the distant cry of a rare bird, but now he too heard only an intense silence. His heart was beating steadily in his ears as he found an unexplained fear creeping over him. Forcefully he shoved the thoughts away and got to his feet, Raymer standing with him. They said nothing for a moment, looking about in all directions and seeing only the faintest evidence of their path from the previous day. Then Edge checked his cloak, pack, and weapon. As they made ready to move again, Raymer said, "What do you think it means?" "Nothing good," Edge replied. "At least we'll hear trouble coming." His eyes came up from his examination. He saw that Raymer was looking past him. Her face was not fearful, but on edge and nervous. He turned to follow her gaze and saw a faint line of black in the distance. Rubbing his face, he looked at Raymer and then back at the smudge on the horizon. That wasn't there a moment ago. No. Edge squinted, but it made no difference. He set his feet and leaned on the haft of his weapon. "We have to keep moving. We're out of supplies. May as well head toward whatever that is." "Something tells me we shouldn't," Raymer said very quietly. "But we have no other choice. Maybe that's why we can see it now." The lost elf stared at her with concern at the cryptic observation, but she took a determined stride forward and he fell in behind her. They walked for almost an hour as the dark obscurity in the distance seemed to move towards them as well. Edge at last had the insight to stop, calling softly to Raymer, "Do you still have the spyglass?" She paused and pulled it from her packs. Setting it to her eyes, she looked out at the outline of the form ahead of them. He watched her tense as the image came into focus. "It's not possible." "What isn't possible?" "There are trees, great black trees, and it seems beyond reason, Edge, but I think I see the tower." It was beyond reason, for Edge had believed it to be at least several more days before it would come into view. He walked swiftly up beside her, and she passed the device to him wordlessly. Through the lens, he saw that she was right. There were wide, gnarled trunks of tall, leafless trees of black bark, and yes, something lay past them, though he would not say for certain what it was, if it was what they sought. "We have to keep moving." Raymer did not answer, for there was really no need. There was only the one course of action available to them, and both knew and feared it, but could not turn away. They began walking once more, and Edge considered that perhaps what lay ahead was merely a small grove that had dug in through the harsh climbs of the frozen reach. He was about to remark on this when Raymer when a violent gust of wind ripped through them, nearly tossing him into the air. The burst subsided, but soon another swept up, and then another. Soon there was no delay between them, and a veritable tempest raged about the two as they struggled forward. Raymer tried to call to Edge over the noise, but it was too much. Her voice was spirited away on the wind. Edge grasped her hand tightly, and together they drove onward, knowing that if they stopped, they would never start moving again. The wind only got worse, tearing into his cloak and armor, leaving both their faces blistered and frozen. It seemed that the howling went on for hours. Edge pushed on, but he stumbled more and more. Eventually he found himself down on his knees, weakened and unable to move any more. Raymer was there, heaving his arm up onto her shoulder and driving them both towards the trees, despite her smaller frame. Edge leaned on her so heavily he thought she must collapse, but she refused to do so. For another hour or more they pushed on, the fiery determination and love of the last air of House Squall being the only thing that kept them moving. At last the wind seemed to reach the strength so violent they could not overcome it together, and both of them fell into the snow. Edge strained to look upwards, Raymer driving herself to her hands and knees. Suddenly, just as they seemed about to surrender to the elements, the maelstrom relented. Raymer saw dark nettles on the ground and slowly raised her head. Impossibly, they now stood at the very entrance to the dark shade of the trees. Equally impossible, given the complete absence of leaves or needles on any of the branches, there was almost no light beneath them. Raymer rose unsteadily to her feet, and Edge came up beside her. They exchanged a look of doubt and then determination, and together with hands clasped, they took one bold step forward. Soon they were walking in the smothering dark of the wood, the winds and snows seeming to have magically evaporated behind them. At first the walk was almost pleasant. The air was still bitterly cold, but the lack of wind and snow made it much easier going, even though they had to weave between the thin, rough trunk of the great trees. Edge removed his gloves and ran his hand on the bark, coming free with the thin coating of dark sap that clung to his fingers. Raymer, though she could not have told him why, grabbed his hand and put the glove back on. Without a word, he allowed her to do so, taking in the serious light of her eyes and deciding it was better to follow her lead. They passed through the thickest of the trees, pushing back heavy branches and ducking under frailer, thinner ones until at last they appeared to reach an opening. Raymer stepped out of the thicket and gasped. Edge hurried to her side, but it did not take long for him to realize that what had caused her such a shock. There before them, seamless, stood the base of an expansive tower. It was massive, so wide and thick that Edge doubted they could see even a third of its total circumference. The sides were of a smooth, volcanic-looking rock that gleamed in the evening sun, now starting its swift descent. Edge did not realize they had been walking for so long. In fact, he was certain they had not. Raymer also seemed perplexed, but was quickly forgotten as her eyes went up the height of the coiled stone that spun about and around itself, jutting minarets from all manner of unorthodox angles and with uniformly sparse windows. She was not certain she could even see the top. It seemed to disappear into the clouds themselves. From a distance, even using the spyglass, the twists and bends of the building had hurt Edge's eyes. At this range, he could see the black material that made it was something that he was unfamiliar with. Looking closer, now that it stood just before them, he noted visibly deep runic carvings covered the metallic yet somehow stone surface around the building, and it filled him with a deep foreboding. Raymer echoed the thought that had entered his own head. This has to be it, the Twisted Spire. But we shouldn't be here, not yet. It should have taken days. Edge did not say anything, nor did he move at first. He suddenly realized how exposed they were, how easy it must be to see them standing out at the base of the monolith. Edge took Raymer's hand and stepped back a pace, looking about him. We should maybe find shelter elsewhere and come back to this in the morning. Raymer was about to protest, but a cold shiver ran down her spine and she agreed. Yes, let's go make camp and think of what to do. I don't even see a way in. Edge realized he did not see a door either, and in that moment his curiosity got the better of him. He took Raymer's hand gently in his own, and began to walk around the base of the tower, searching for a point of entry of some kind. The deepening end of day was sweeping over the tree line quite rapidly, but the two did not notice just then. The search yielded nothing. The entire base of the tower was seamless, and the nearest windows were so far up the expanse that Edge was not even sure they were apertures at all. Raymer was walking just behind him, but her eyes kept straying to the wood and her thoughts to retreat, though she could not say why. A dreadful sensation began to crawl over her skin then. It started as an itch on her arms, then the hair all over her body seemed to stand on end. As it spread, she could not ignore it any longer. She cried out softly and fearfully, Edge, something's wrong. Edge turned sharply, and his look of shock did nothing to calm Raymer. He rushed to her side and grabbed her arms. Into the trees, now. They rushed towards the tree line, the pulsing twitch covering Raymer's body now spreading to Edge, but as they neared the black trunks and branches he stopped, for the woods was coming back towards them, clutching, reaching, and grabbing. Together they tried to back away, but the branches lunged forward as fearsome faces seemed to appear in the bark of the dark timbers. Edge tried to stand between Raymer and the onslaught, but they came on upon them like a crashing wave, and then there was only blackness. Chapter 3. Arvadas Hawking, currently Arvadas Angladeus, king of Angladeus, finished the last scratch of his quill on the latest orders to be sent by carrier pigeon to the cities of Barrow, Trinalithport, and Dunnigan. There could be a dissent among the people and the lesser nobility, but he knew such actions had to be taken to restore the kingdom to functionality and prepare for the necessary mustering that would allow them to break free of their national imprisonment. He set the last piece of paper aside and leaned back in his chair. Arvadas was awaiting the arrival of the one person he needed to ensure his orders were carried out, and he could hardly believe that given the past month's terrible events, it was actually Carcyrus Vendile's cousin, Nemaria, who would be the one to determine if his taxation requests were even possible. Arvadas had wanted to avoid taxation increases entirely, but every other option seemed impossibly lengthy or simply impossible to implement at all. The fact of the matter was that he had lost many soldiers in both the early efforts to defeat the invaders sealing the nation of Angladeus behind the Pillars of Light and in winning back his rightful place on the throne. In the moments immediately after, the deaths of Lena and Derek had been far more poignant to him, but this was war in all but formal declaration, and that he was faced with now, and war is, in many respects, an art of calculation. The young High Lord Galden stood at Arvadas' side. Barely 16 years of age, he had been under cruel imprisonment when Carcyrus had briefly held power. Freed by Arvadas, he had been spending much of his time with the older man in an attempt to understand the nuances of rule and order in Angladeus. The king had found him a capable youth, but in truth he would have greatly appreciated Fremont Arindian be present instead. However, the High Lord Arindian was occupied in some sort of secretive research in the vaults beneath the palace, and Arvadas saw him only rarely. Had he not known Fremont well, he might have been doubtful of the value of his time reading old books, but he trusted the High Lord would not waste his time, or that of his king, on a fruitless search. Earl Galden, despite his youth, had grown rather bold in the past week. He looked at the pile of edicts and then at Arvadas before saying, "Do we really have to wait for her? You are the king." Arvadas looked up at the face of the young man, understanding his frustration at being beholden to a Vendile, after Carcyrus had imprisoned him and forced him to turn against his home. Arvadas had removed High Lord Bremer from his position, effectively erasing the house from existence. Renan Ordland's new house now held the briefly vacated 1/8 of the power within Angladeus. Arvadas doubted that Teneral would understand that Geladan Bremer had requested entry as a common soldier to the army he once commanded in an attempt at redemption. To the boy, those who stood with Vendile were traitors and likely deserved the same fate as Brucius Hladic, who had killed himself rather than face justice. The king I am, but a good king is always careful not to place himself above the land he serves. Arvadas placed one hand on the pile of papers and added, "It's important to remember that our nation has existed with 8 High Lords since Serestus Angladeus united us. There has always been a High Lord or High Lady Vendile, and we should endeavor to maintain that stability." "The last Vendile tried to have you and several other High Lords killed," Galden replied. "It seems he was not so concerned about preserving the sanctity of our nation. And that is all the more reason we should not act as our enemy would have." This point seemed to satisfy Teneral for the moment. It was convenient that the doors of the council chamber opened and the guard admitted 2 women dressed in the colors of Hladic and Vendile, respectively. Arvadas rose and greeted them both with politeness and sincerity, though he was surprised to see the High Lady Hladic had accompanied the newly appointed High Lady Vendile. As if understanding his puzzlement, Eladria Hladic spoke first. Young Namaria has been staying with me since making the journey from Trinilith Port to Alderlast. I thought she might find my home more accommodating. Yes, the younger woman said. My traitorous cousin kept his home covered in fairly unnerving decor. Arvadas smiled politely and said, Let's speak no more of it. That period is thankfully past us. He turned to allow them to seat themselves in their respective places, while also inviting them to greet his aide. May I introduce High Lord Tenar Galdan? I believe you have met him before, High Lady Hladic. Once, she said simply. My husband was not a man who engaged with his fellow High Lords often. Forgive me, High Lord Galdan. I shall have to rectify that sometime in the near future. Tenar, clearly unsure how to behave in the suddenly formal atmosphere of the meeting, merely bowed his head in acknowledgement. Arvadas sat in his chair and placed his hands on the table. I asked you here, High Lady Vendile, because I wanted the approval and keen eye of your house as regards my intentions for raising money to fund the military operations necessary to secure our kingdom, and perhaps ensure the safety of those beyond our borders. In short, we must find a way to breach the walls of this devilish fortress, to make certain that the world outside does not fall into fouler forces than we suspect. High Lady Hladic said nothing but put her hand to her face and looked sideways at High Lady Vendile, waiting for her response. The younger woman, with her dark hair and clothed in an extravagant but tasteful purple dress, extended her hand, and Arvadas passed her the papers. I signed them already so that we could send the correspondence immediately, if you approved of them. The High Lady took the pile and leafed through them, setting a few aside. In a matter of perhaps 10 minutes, she had removed a third of the small pile. She slid the larger collection back to Arvadas. These, she said, are reasonable and can be sent immediately. The rest I would modify in a number of ways. Tenar Galdan could not disguise his irritation. Such as? You think we should tax them more? Namaria was only in her early 20s, but the look she gave the High Lord Galdan could have come from a much older and much more experienced expert in both tact and finances. She took the smaller pile and rearranged that into 3 further groupings. Allow me to explain, if you would, my king? Arvadas, mildly amused at the casual dismissal of Galdan's dissent, nodded in silent approval. High Lady Vendile placed a finger on the rightmost selections. These, she observed, are bound for the traders and merchants in Barrow. However, you're proposing that they pay an increase of 5% on their sales. Traders in that city do not have much in the way of valuable items and are also likely to be walking a finer line month to month, even week to week, between purchasing necessities and having any funds left over for their trade. In contrast, she pulled a sheet from the rightmost pile, the merchants in Trinilith Port, my home, are far wealthier on average and could absorb the proposed increase of 7% taxation. Indeed, they could likely handle as much as 12% without much trouble. However, you've forgotten the rather human side of this matter, which is that if word of the fees is to spread from town to town, if you only increase the cost for those in Trinilith by 2% more than those in Barrow, it will seem to them a feeble increase on their richer neighbors. At the same time, if you raise a much higher rate on the traders in Trinilith Port, they will see you as bullying them for their prosperity. Either way, you'll upset the people you need to pay into the nation's dwindled funds and increase the likelihood of tax dodging or smuggling. Arvadas was quite impressed, despite himself, and smiled at the cleverness of Namaria. Tenar Galdan was not so convinced. So what do we do then? Just not tax them at all? We're trying to prepare for a war. We have to pay for it somehow. Of course you tax them, High Lady Vendile replied. You just need to draw up the forms with a bit more complexity. I can find a way to tax the most lucrative trades in Trinilith without raising the fees so much it greatly upsets the merchant houses there. In Barrow and Dunnigan as well, I might add, you could tax the guild houses and mining companies more severely than the individual traders. That's the price of doing business in a larger, more stable environment. And while they may not like it, they can understand that it is typical cost of being a member of such an organization. The people rely on those guilds to ensure that they have somewhere to sell their goods at all times, Arvadas said thoughtfully. Do we really want to make it more costly for them to do so? Because of their membership, they can absorb the additional expense, Namaria answered. It would be the smaller, single families and businesses that would suffer the most. By being more precise in your taxation, you can get the funding you need and avoid angering the people. And, High Lady Hladic interjected, I will send the priests to the cities to issue these decrees and express the importance of supplying funds to our army to rescue the nation from this dark isolation that has been forced upon us. They can also collect donations from those willing to give. Arvadas had been rubbing his chin throughout the entire time, and after a few moments of silence, he nodded to himself and gestured with an open hand towards High Lady Vendile. Namaria, I am glad I asked you to attend the meeting and provide your input. I wanted it to act as the beginning of patching up our family's old wounds, and the more recent ones, and it has served an even more powerful purpose than that. Please take those papers you set aside and review them, alter each as needed, and have them returned to me for signing and dispersal. I trust you to arrange everything for the benefit of Angladeus. Namaria blushed slightly at such high praise and bowed her head in thanks. Rising from the table, she took the collection of papers and excused herself. As she was readying to leave, Eladria Hladek said from her seat, "Tenarel, perhaps you could escort the High Lady out. I need to speak with the king on another matter." High Lord Galden looked to Arvadas for approval, and the king waved him away. Rising, Tenarel bowed both to he and High Lady Hladek before taking Nemaria's arm and leading her out of the council chamber. As the door closed, Eladria stood and walked to the far side of the table, her hands behind her red flowing dress, outlined sharply in gold as she studied the columns that surrounded the room and the small balconies above it. Arvadas said nothing, waiting to hear what it was the High Lady wanted. She finally turned and placed her hand on the section of the table that had once been Dwemer's, the red eighth of a circle still bearing his charging boar symbol. "Renon has not yet chosen his house's insignia," Arvadas explained to her. "It was very audacious of you, Arvadas, to completely eradicate the existence of one of our High Lord houses. I understand that my husband, Geldan Dwemer, and Carcyrus Vendile tried to murder you and several others, but I am loath to see our traditions scrubbed away so rashly." Arvadas bristled at the lecturing tone, but kept his cool. Galaduan abdicated his position. I simply accepted his request. "You could have said no," Eladria answered matter-of-factly. "You allowed me to assume my husband's position, and even went so far as to find a distant cousin to replace Carcyrus and maintain Vendile's position as a High Lord house." She turned to him and adjusted her rounded high cap slightly over her silver hair. "I believe your decision was just, but it does seem to go against your duty as a Hawking to uphold the tenets of the code." "Perhaps," Arvadas admitted, "but it's a choice I've made." "Yes," High Lady Hladek agreed. "For the better of Angladeus, I'm sure. And now, I would ask you to act once more in the interest of our nation." Arvadas said nothing but waited. "You know, of course, what they found in my husband's private chambers at the monastery. His ambitions as a politician were an affront enough to his duties, but to have preyed on the children of Alderlast and using his most holy position to do so." Eladria shuddered in disgust and shook her head. "I will speak no more of the particulars, but the nature of such an act reveals what I fear is the true plague on our country, and the real reason we are unable to break free of the foul arcane powers that trap us in our lands." Arvadas leaned forward, steepling his fingers and cocking his head in curiosity. "I'm not entirely sure I understand you." "I'll be direct. There are foul sins that have crept into our nation. I never loved my husband, Arvadas. I was married to him because it was a fitting match, and for my part, a great opportunity to join one of the 8 fabled houses of our country. But Brucius never cared for the duties of our priests or the high chant, aside from their role in exerting his personal authority. Our nation is sick, infested with a vileness that nearly destroyed you, and there is only one way to cure this plague." Arvadas studied the older woman before him. He had known Eladria Hladek to be far more devout than her late husband, though that would not have been much of an accomplishment. He had not realized she was so zealous as she sounded to him now. Her eyes burned with a passion he had not expected, and he thought back to the stories of her visiting the poor and sick throughout Alderlast with the priests to bring cures and prayers for health. He knew she was sincere in her beliefs, and the way her eyes lit up like that of a young child in the face of an older woman told him she was certain she had found the root of the trouble in Angladeus. "I don't know if I believe we are as corrupted as you say, High Lady, but I would listen to your proposed course of action." "I fear we are far worse off than you realize, Arvadas. Tell me, why did Runedin Kalavar not call upon the divine power of Paladinus to strike down Vendile the usurper, or even before that, to smash the walls of this dread fortress with all our resources are now devoted to and making? Not even your own son was able to use his might as a paladin to take righteous vengeance on our enemies." Arvadas straightened at the mention of Varasho, but he held his face as impassively as he could. "That is true, I had not considered it in the moment." "Had not considered it?" Eladria Hladek's tone was incredulous. "Perhaps we are worse off than I believe if the very King Bangladeus does not look to our sworn protector in his time of greatest need. For my part, I've always believed that Paladinus prefers we help ourselves when we can." "A noble thought," the High Lady admitted, "but naive. We are faced with a horrible danger that is not outside our lands, but within it. I have, since before my husband had the wisdom to take his own life, been working to undo this illness in our realm from within. And now I ask only your permission to sanction my final act." Arvadas felt tension rising within him as High Lady Hladek walked slowly around the table to his side, sitting in the chair next to his own. He looked at her sideways and said, "Tell me what you wish done." She took his hands in hers and leaned close, where he could see the lines of age were not enough to blot out the light of passion in her eyes. "I've recruited a number of priests, paladins, and common men and women to swear solemn oaths to Paladinus and his children, Varanus and Onatha. The gods have heard us and will grant us mighty boons that will allow for the removal of whatever foul presence is poisoning our home. I want you to sanction the formation of this group, and permit me to send them out as truth seekers to cleanse the kingdom." Arvadas kept her gaze for a moment. Then he stood suddenly and turned his back. He laughed, short and mirthless, before turning to her. "The truth seekers. Those who tried to unify Nepal and executed any who would not swear loyalty to Varanus and his kin. You're talking about instituting an inquisition, Eladria, hunting down men and women within our country and interrogating them or worse." Her face remained impassive, and Arvadas' eyes widened in shock. "You've already started, haven't you? You're not asking for my permission to do it. You want your actions validated before the people and free rein to continue. How is your grandson, Arvadas? The king flinched as if struck by an actual blow, and his face reddened. You do not know of what you speak. I know that your younger son, Logan, had an affair that led to a child. I also heard that the mother died tragically attempting to help you reclaim the throne. It would be a pity to tarnish her heroism with stories of such misconduct, and it might even be enough to prevent Logan from being allowed to return to Angladeus. He's taking the right, Arvadas said through gritted teeth. He will be absolved of any affronts to the code when he returns. Perhaps, Eladria said, but what of your other son? Arvadas was now truly stunned, but his shock was far surpassed by his fury. He pointed a finger at High Lady Vladik and, with extreme control, was just able to prevent himself from shouting at her. That is only rumor and hearsay. No one would believe any accusations. No man or woman on the street might, Eladria replied calmly, but he is a paladin and subject to examination in the temple conducted by my priests before Paladinus himself. You know what would happen if these whispers were proven true. Arvadas said nothing. His rage was enormous, more so even than when Vendile had threatened him and flaunted the sacred laws of his home in this very chamber months before. Somehow Eladria had gotten spies into his estate in the halls of his palace, perhaps some time ago. Realizing his fists were clenched in fury, Arvadas closed his eyes and took several deep breaths as he tried to calm himself. High Lady Vladik sighed and walked over to him, placing a hand not unkindly on his shoulder. I'm sorry to have to force your hand like this, Arvadas, but it must be done. Without the powers of our gods behind us, we'll never defeat the evil at our doorstep. Arvadas glared at her, then brushed her hand aside. I will sanction the employment of the truth-seekers, but you will keep me informed daily of their actions and use them specifically to strengthen the powers of the army against this outside threat. We need to focus on the real danger to Angladeus, not a witch hunt. Of course. Without further discussion, Eladria turned and excused herself from the room. At first, Arvadas could not move, his anger still too deep and consuming. He clenched and unclenched his fists over and over, trying to find some modicum of peace, but it would not come. To have prevented Vendile from taking over the kingdom, and the price many had paid to keep that beast from destroying all Angladeus stood for, it seemed unfair now to be fighting a different kind of battle for the soul of his home. Worse, it seemed that this particular fight was going to come very close to Arvadas' true family. Unsure of what else to do, he strode quickly out of the room and headed for the doors to the vaults, to seek the counsel of High Lord Arindian. Just as Arvadas was leaving his council chamber in a fury, night had begun to creep over the pillars of light on the northern edge of Cloud Peak Basin. In his high-steepled tent, Renan Orlan, the new commander of the Angladaic army and recently raised High Lord, watched the twilight settle slowly outside the folds of cloth. Several of Renan's servants, though the very idea that he had servants still perplexed the man who had once been a common soldier, were igniting small lanterns around his quarters to provide more light that the warming braziers could not. It had grown cold as it could get in Cloud Peak Basin, and what passed for winter there had come in the previous weeks. Arms crossed, his dark blue cloak lined with silver hanging limply behind him, Renan considered the futility of his position. Arvadas Angladeus, king of the Angladaic nation, had believed the machinations of the former High Lords Haladic and Vendile and Bwemmer, at the direction of the traitor king, had prevented the nation from mustering the strength to drive a hole through the fortress and the pillars. And yet, here he had sat for a month, unable to come up with a plan that would rectify the situation. As he scanned the fields beyond his tent, the newest High Lord fidgeted with his recently completed insignia now pinned to his tunic, a silver blade pointing downward over a dark blue field. He was uncomfortable being a High Lord, a nobleman. The army had suited him well, and now Renan feared he might be losing his connection to the military life he adored. As commander, he was the one ordering men to die and staying clear of the threats they faced, rather than charging headlong into battle himself. Perhaps it was why the problem perplexed him so. There seemed to be no direct means of ending the threat to the fortress fused in the rock of the pillars, and Renan was not one for subterfuge or deceit. As Renan watched the night come on, another man came through the flaps of the tent. He paused upon seeing the High Lord, but then a simple nod, an extended hand from Renan put him at ease. Varasho Angladeus, Arvadas Hawking's eldest son, had been advising Renan and acting as the lead officer for the small contingent of paladins positioned near the fortress. Renan's first act as commander had been to decrease the number of men at the front, sending as many home as he could. His rationale had been that until they came up with a plan, there was nothing that could be done anyway. No reason to keep the men from their families if they had nothing for them to do. Varasho, his long blonde hair held back by a thin metal circlet, walked past Renan and studied the war table. In a real campaign, it would have been covered in markers depicting troop movements and locations of forces of both enemy army and their own, but this showed only the pillars and a black mass that was the impeding fortress. Varasho shook his head and said, I can never get over how glaringly simple the problem we face is, and how impossible it seems to find a solution to it. Renan did not reply, turning back to the tent entrance as the third member of their council entered. Galadan Bwemmer was dressed as a simple soldier, wearing the colors of Renan's newly appointed house. The clothes had to have been made only recently, as Renan had just settled on his symbol a few days before, but Bwemmer was clearly trying to show his loyalty as best he could. The former traitor who had surrendered his position to Arvadas and asked to serve in the army had proved invaluable. Rhinon considered him a hugely important asset, though understandably Varasho still detested him. Boehmer saluted them both and walked to the table, where Varasho shuffled aside so as not to have to stand too close to his former enemy. Rhinon joined them and leaned on the table, examining the unchanged layout of the field outside the pillars. His eyes turned on Varasho. Did our reconnaissance attempt yield anything? The prince nodded, but shrugged as well. Yes, but none of it was good. We can't find a crack or crevice in the wall, and it seems so empowered by magic that any means of breaching it would require the powers of the arcane as well. There has to be something we can do, Boehmer said in frustration. The priests or paladins could call for divine might to smash a hole in the fortress, couldn't they? Perhaps, Varasho admitted, but we would need hundreds of both. And you've seen what happens when anyone is visible from the walls and starts trying to even test the defenses. That wizard is simply too powerful, and he certainly has no qualms about killing anyone foolish enough to let him see them. Rhinon rubbed his chin, now heavy with beard growth from lack of a razor. Boehmer looked at his commander and saw the sunken eyes and heavy weight of his brow. You've not been sleeping again. Varasho looked up as well. It's the weight of command. I'm not surprised you did not recognize it, Boehmer. The former High Lord ignored the barb and straightened. We should all try to get some rest and think of what we are going to report back to Alderlast. We have to tell them something. What? Rhinon snarled as he swept a number of small tokens on the table depicting unit positions to the ground. What should we tell them? That we determined the fortress is impenetrable, that there's nothing we can do. I know it's disappointing, my lord, Boehmer said, but we have to let them know we're at least trying. Varasho, for once, saw the wisdom in Boehmer's attempts to appease Rhinon. He's right. They need to know we're doing what we can, even if it's not much. Rhinon did not answer, looking at the scattered tokens on the table and the floor. He bent to pick up a few that had fallen, angry at his own rashness, but a hand caught his arm. Boehmer was staring at the fallen symbols for various military assets, and his eyes were wide with inspiration. My lord, he said, have you ever heard of sapping? Varasho was the one who answered. You mean demolition? Yes. Boehmer straightened along with Rhinon and took a step toward the table. The fortress has no gate, no doors, and is built right up against the rock itself. We can't scale it with ladders or siege engines, as the wizard within will ignite them before we get close enough. But what if we went underneath the walls? How? Rhinon asked. We can't get close enough to use siege equipment. How would we get near enough the wall long enough to tunnel under it? Varasho seemed to understand what Boehmer was thinking. The reconnaissance unit got close enough, briefly. We could try. Boehmer shrugged. The miners in Barrow keep small stores of black powder for sealing shafts that are dangerous or no longer hold any value. I'm certain we could get some sent here. I'll have it requisitioned, Rhinon said with finality. Varasho, do you think there's a way to get men to the wall long enough to tunnel under it? The prince crossed his arms. I don't know. It's impossible to be sure how much time it would take, and the earth near the pillars is rocky and difficult to move. If we get enough powder under the wall, we can blast through the ground. No need to concern ourselves with the fortress itself. A big enough hole, we can send men in, maybe faster than they can defend or seal it. Boehmer looked at first one man then the other. I know it's a risk, but we haven't made any progress, and perhaps it's time to try something different. Rhinon nodded definitively. We'll try it. Varasho, get a unit of men to handle the sapping, maybe recruit a few miners if you can. Boehmer and I will have soldiers standing by in the event of a breach, and we can give this a chance. Very well, Varasho said. After all, it's better than nothing. The others left him as Rhinon sat down to pen orders for what was needed. He had his servants put out the other lanterns so that he was writing by the light of the one near him and could take a brief moment of calm in the semi-darkness. But his attempts to relax were foiled by the constant looks he gave the model of the fortress, his nemesis in stone and magic, that rested near him on the war table, mocking him with its looming presence from across the room. Forcing his doubts from his mind, he signed the last sheet and readied for a fitful night of brief rest. Wolfbane took only a hunk of coarse dark bread and some boiled potatoes before settling outside the worn fence by the farmhouse. He refused to remain inside, lest his ploy bring the creature to the home and inadvertently bring further harm to the family already plagued by its presence. Caramon had insisted that his men set at least a few of their number on the perimeter, though Wolfbane confidently informed him they would be either butchered or passed by entirely. Bears are not so clever as that, Caramon had told him. I doubt we are dealing with a bear, was the plain reply. Caramon chose not to question his superior and sent one of the men not on patrol to rig a makeshift shelter for him using some fence posts and a canvas stretching from one side of the farmhouse. He watched the process mutely as the first few snowflakes began to fall, eyeing the sky to determine if there was an approaching storm or merely a bit of light precipitation. By the time the shelter was ready, it was a slow, steady stream of small flakes. Grumbling to himself, he did his best to find a dry space against the wall of the house, placed his sword near his hand, and tried to doze off. Wolfbane was alert but deep in thought. He sat cross-legged in the snow, watching the shapes of the men wandering the perimeter and pondering what he would do if his challenge to the beast did not draw it out. If this creature was truly an animal, it should be drawn to the marking he left and seek him, as long as it wasn't wandering too far afield from its natural hunting grounds. The snow concerned him only because it obscured his vision. and he suspected he might need to see clearly from some distance to know when the beast was near. As he began considering moving on to the roof of the farmhouse, a great wail went up from the whitewood. It was a piercing, lilting howl that rode through the air like a gust of a terrible wind. Wolfbane was on his feet quickly, stiff from sitting but tense and ready to act, as he was casting about with his eyes for some sign of the creature. Caramon was at his side swiftly, sword in hand. "Call your men in," Wolfbane told them. "They're vulnerable out in the snow and so distant from one another." Caramon shouted and waved his free hand to the two nearest the wood. The first, a young woman with bow and blade, came over at a steady gait, clearly having heard and been frightened by the sound from the forest. The second, an even younger man of the north, paused, looking in the direction of the whitewood as though he saw something, then began to make his way back as well. Wolfbane watched them, both hands on his axe, and it was he that saw the immense mound of black shadow come behind the second soldier. Caramon gave a sharp intake of breath and pulled his shield from his back, holding it out in front of him and at the ready. The patrolman did not seem to notice anything amiss, and Wolfbane stopped Caramon from alerting him. The great hunched form soon cast its shadow over the approaching guard. It was a tremendous rounded shape with sharp protrusions extending all across its back and shoulders. Wolfbane could see it might, indeed, have once been a bear, but there was something truly alien about whatever foulness this thing was now. The man-at-arms realized he was being overtaken and turned, a horrified scream catching in his throat, and the monster cut him to pieces with one tremendous swing of its titanic claws. Caramon took a step back and studied Wolfbane, but the man from the west did not move. He let his axe lower in one hand, and taking a deep breath, he bellowed out a wordless challenge almost as terrifying as the wail the beast had emitted moments before. The warrior took off through the snow, axe now raised in both hands, heading straight for the monstrosity before him. It was a full 30 yards between them, and the creature made no move to step aside or return the assault. As Wolfbane came close enough to see it clearly, he was mesmerized by the unnatural form it took. The spine seemed to be breaking through the beast's back, the bone, bound only slightly in taut skin and sinew, was visible and seemed to ooze a peculiar fluid. The thing's head was huge and low, as though the neck bent under its weight and kept it back below the hulking back. Wolfbane could see the claws, massive black talons in the snow, and the spines of bone that jutted out in seemingly random places across the fiend's body. As he closed, Wolfbane skirted to his left and chopped hard at the head. The creature was shockingly quick, sidestepping the blow and rounding on Wolfbane with a swipe from his titanic claws. The old warrior, still nimble despite his age, rolled back and just clear of the reaching slash. An arrow struck the beast in the left shoulder, another took it in the back. Caramon's housecarls and shield maidens had joined the fight, albeit from a safe distance, and yet the creature seemed unfazed and roared in hatred. Rearing up to lunge at Wolfbane again. Having completed his roll, the warrior sprung forward and swung upward with his axe. The keen blade sliced one of the monster's front legs clean off, but the other thrust forward, and two of the claws bit into Wolfbane's right shoulder. Like a cat with a mouse, the beast tossed him through the air toward the farm before shambling and stumbling after him. Caramon was not a brave man, but he was one who wanted fame and authority. Seeing a chance to raise his status in Wolfbane's eyes, he charged forward and stepped between the creature and the Nerathian commander. Two of his men closed in as well, while the third shot an arrow at the beast. Wolfbane was rising from the blood-stained snow, his right arm limp and torn at his side, looking around for his battle-axe to rejoin the fight. As he did, he grabbed a flask from his belt and pulled the cork free with his teeth. Dousing his wounds in the stinging liquid, he grimaced as the injury began to mend, and gulped the rest of the potion down, tossing the vial aside. As his arm began to slowly repair the severed muscles in it, he flexed it and ignored the pain it caused. If he could find his axe and the potion did its work fast enough, he believed he could still take the monster down. The creature was in a rage, bleeding excessively all over the snow. A dark ichor seemed to sprout from the stump, and the eyes of the beast were now visible to Caramon, who noted to his shock they had no pupils. Thinking quickly, he wondered if this meant the creature was blind. Wrapping his sword hilt against his shield, he was rewarded by the lunge of the monster in his direction. Unprepared for the reach and speed of the beast, he managed to take the strike on his shield, but the wooden slats burst and he was knocked down, holding only the thin leather strap that had once been attached to the back of his sole means of protection. The soldiers with Caramon dove in bravely, but his housecarls were no match for the creature. One managed to drive a blade between its ribs, but was rewarded only with a swift backhand that left her head a ruined mess. The second one quickly backpedaled, and Caramon could see he was on the verge of running. Then Wolfbane was back in the fray, axe recovered, and with two brutal swings he had the beast's left arm dangling at its side. The creature stumbled then, black liquid pouring across the snow, and its mouth, full of far too many teeth, hanging open dumbly. It threw back its head to roar, but before the sound could fully escape, Wolfbane gave one last mighty swing and decapitated the beast. The body of the monster slumped forward, then slowly fell to its side. Wolfbane stood there, his cloak of furs forgotten and abandoned in the chaos of battle, breathing heavily and wiping the black filth from his face. Caramon stood, testing his shield arm for breaks or bruises, and came to his side. They said nothing, watching the indescribable mass before them as though waiting for it to rise and strike again. Wolfbane stepped forward and grasped one of the bony protrusions, snapping it off and testing the weight. Caramon kept his distance, saying, "It might be best to leave it. Maybe it was a bear once, but whatever it is now can come to no good." Perhaps, Wolfbane answered as he crouched beside the bestial form, but I would know what would cause such a transformation if we can. Caramon felt a great unease wash over him so strongly he nearly pushed forward and pulled Wolfbane away from the corpse. Only his sense of deference to established hierarchy kept him from doing so, as the large man, his hair hanging loose and floating in the wind, bent still lower and remarked, "Something still pulsing inside the body." Caramon was about to tell Wolfbane to come back towards him, but then the warrior reached his left hand through one of the tears in the beast's flesh and, finding some resistance, shoved it forward until his arm disappeared almost to the shoulder. He narrowed his eyes and gritted his teeth as he dug around within the body. The spectacle bringing Caramon even greater unease, outpaced only by morbid curiosity. The Thane of Erephos came forward just as Wolfbane wrenched his arm free and held out his hand. In his palm, covered in the dark foulness of whatever constituted the blood of the thing he'd slain, Wolfbane held a perfectly symmetrical ruby with hexagonal facets. It was throbbing, more subtly than it had within the creature, and appeared to ooze the vile purulence that had spewed forth from the monster when it was wounded. Caramon felt his fear growing at the sight of the gem. That can't be a prize, to have come from inside that horror. We should dispose of it. Wolfbane wiped some of the inky fluid from the stone, considering Caramon's words, then walked over to the body of the soldier whose head had been crushed by the beast, tearing free a ruined part of her cloak. He wrapped the gem in it and turned to Caramon. I can think of one who might be able to tell us what it is. I would know what sort of magic it possesses. Caramon still felt something inexplicably ominous about the entire exchange, but again chose to say nothing. Wolfbane walked to his mount and placed the strange package in his saddlebags. As he did, the door of the farmstead opened and fearful eyes emerged. The family came out of the farmhouse cautiously, then unmasked, as they realized the terror that had haunted them and their neighbors was truly dead. The old man came up beside Wolfbane, watching the black horror that loomed still, even in death, from the snow. The Nerathian commander looked at him, said nothing, and turned to walk back towards the horses. "Burn the body," Caramon told the old man before hurrying after Wolfbane. "My lord, we should have your injured arm examined." "I'll be fine until we reach Nepal City. Let's go." "My lord," the old farmer was moving as fast as he could to catch up with Wolfbane, "you must let us tend to your wounds and your men. We cannot repay you enough for this." Wolfbane stopped and turned sharply. He eyed the old man up and down, looked at Caramon for a moment, then said, "You can repay me by spreading word of this deed. Wolfbane will protect the people of the north. Tell your neighbors that. Have them spread the word, and send them to me in Nepal City if they need assistance. They should know such problems will be made right." The old man accepted this with a clasping of his hands and many gestures of thanks. As Wolfbane hauled himself into the saddle, waiting for Caramon and his remaining housecarls to join him, the young survivor Grayson came forward. "My lord, what about the dead men?" "Bury them here. They were soldiers. They may rest on the field they died on." The boy seemed to understand. As he turned to go back to his family, elated at their salvation, he paused and came back. "My lord?" "Yes?" "There are legends of Whitewood that talk of such beasts as the one you killed. They say they came into being because of the dark magic of Nathran Emberstone." Wolfbane turned in his saddle to look down at the boy. "Who is Nathran Emberstone?" It was Caramon that answered, now riding up beside Wolfbane. He was a leader of a cult of Silverleaf Elves that tried to take the Whitewood during the Age of Faith. A powerful druid, but some say he also possessed far darker gifts steeped in madness and flame. Wolfbane considered this and then asked, "Did he have monsters like this one in his service?" Caramon shrugged. "Depending on which legends you believe, he had several or entire armies. It's an old tale, one used to frighten children from going into the Whitewood. Some even claim Emberstone's ghost is still there, urging the forest to take back the north." Wolfbane said nothing but looked at Grayson. The boy returned the look unflinchingly with his one eye, and Wolfbane bent down in his saddle, extending a hand holding a small coin. The boy took it, noted the steel that made it and the fearsome wolf's head on one side, a drop of rain or perhaps blood on the other. "If you hear or see anything more of beasts like that one that harmed you and your family, come to Nepal City and ask for me. That coin will grant you passage." Wolfbane straightened and took his reins in his hands, adding, "And if nothing troubles your family further, then when you come of age seek me out. I'll find a place for you in my army." The party from Nepal City rode off without another word, quickly speeding to a near gallop as they left the farmstead behind. Grayson watched them go for a time, even after he could no longer see them in the distance, and clutched the coin in his hand. He looked down at it as his old grandfather came over to bring him inside, as several of the family worked to make a pyre around the body of the monster. Grayson stared at the wolf's head on the coin, before he finally allowed himself to be escorted back to his home and out of the cold. So that's chapter 3, and hopefully on Tuesday we'll pick up with chapter 4, but again, depending on moving, it may have to get pushed back or changed. So you can always follow the Twitch channel to get the latest updates and see the latest live reads. It's also available on YouTube under the same name, VultureX21 on YouTube, and you can send questions or other comments to @LegacyChronicle on Twitter. If you're interested in buying books and you want to get them not through Amazon, if you go to the Facebook page for the Legacy Chronicle, you can order them directly from me, and I will happily sign them and mail them to you. Take all kinds of electronic payment and checks. It's super easy, whatever works for you. Hope everybody has a great rest of their weekend, what's left of it, and thank you for listening.